She was starving, shivering, and stealing rotten fruit behind a stranger's barn. Until a lantern cracked the night, and a man's voice asked the one question she never expected. "When's the last time you ate?" This isn't just a story about hunger. It's about grace at the edge of death, about a mother's love that wouldn't break, until someone else helped her carry it. Stay with us. You need to hear this. Wyoming Territory, December 1876. Nora Tate's fingers were stiff with frostbite as they clawed through a pile of snow-laced garbage behind a stranger's barn. The wind sliced through her like a whip, but she barely noticed anymore. Hunger had dulled everything except instinct. Her hand landed on something soft. Too soft. A half-rotten apple, black on one side, frozen through on the other. She wiped the mold on her skirt, turned, and held it out to her daughter. "Here, Pearl." The 8-year-old took the fruit without flinching. She bit into it as if it were a feast, though it gave beneath her teeth like old leather. She didn't complain. Hunger had taught her that hope was a luxury, not a right. Beside them, little Fay, 6 and too fragile for her age, clutched a rag doll that looked more like a dust mop than a toy. Her lips were blue. Her teeth chattered. "Mama," she whispered. "My hands hurt." Nora pulled both girls close, trying to share a warmth she no longer had. "I know, baby." "We're almost done thieving," Pearl muttered, her voice hollow. That word cut deeper than the cold. Thieving. Nora's gut twisted. "They fell off the tree," she said, more to herself than the girls. "Nobody wanted them." "Then why are we hidin'?" She had no answer. Because they were thieves now. Because 3 months ago she had a roof, a hearth, and a man who said he'd send for them from Montana. But Jeb Tate had vanished into the silver mines, and so Nora had done the only thing left. She packed what they had and walked west. No wagon, no coin, just legs and will. Now here they were, scraping rot off frozen fruit. Pearl knelt beside her. "I found 3 good ones." "Good girl." Nora's hands trembled as they worked. Her fingers were raw, nails broken to the quick. 3 months on foot had hollowed her out, body and soul. And then, cree. The barn door groaned open behind them. A lantern beam cut the darkness, yellow and merciless. Boots crunched on snow, heavy, measured. Nora froze. She turned slowly, pulling her daughters behind her like a shield of flesh and skirts. Her heart beat like a war drum. This was it. He'd call them thieves. He'd call the sheriff. He'd unleash dogs, maybe worse. The man stepped into view. Broad shoulders, heavy coat, face shadowed beneath a wide brim hat. 10 feet away, he stopped. Nora straightened her spine. "Please, sir, we weren't—" "How long since you ate?" he asked. The question stopped her breath in her throat. Not "what are you doing?" Not "get off my land," just that. "How long since you ate?" Nora couldn't speak. 3 days, Pearl answered. "A lady at a church gave us bread. Before that, longer." The man's jaw tightened. "You sleepin' rough?" "We found a cave. It broke the wind." He muttered something under his breath. Then, to her shock, he shrugged off his thick sheepskin coat and extended it. "Put this on the little one." "We can't," Nora whispered. "I ain't askin'." His voice was gentle, firm. Nora's hands moved without her say-so. She wrapped the coat around Fay. The little girl gasped, curling into its warmth. "Mama," she whispered, wonderstruck. "It's so warm now." The man nodded toward the house, where warm light leaked from frosted windows. "Come on, you're all coming inside. There's stew on the stove and a fire in the hearth." "We can't accept—" You keep saying what you can't do, he interrupted, not harshly. What you can do is walk 50 yards, sit by the fire, and eat supper. Will you? Why? The word burst out. Why would you help us? He didn't speak right away. Then, 'cause someone helped me once when I had nothing. I swore I'd pay it forward. He paused, eyes steady on hers. Looks like today's the day. Something cracked inside her. Not quite hope, maybe the memory of it. What's your name? She asked. Holt Vance, he said, tipping his hat. And you are? Nora Tate. This is Pearl, that's Faye. Well, Mrs. Tate, are you gonna stand out here arguing while your girls freeze, or let me do one decent thing today? Pearl tugged her sleeve. Mama, please. Faye's shaken even in the coat. Nora looked down at her daughters. Gaunt cheeks, barely standing legs. She thought about pride. Then she thought about Faye gnawing on a rotten apple in the snow. All right, she whispered. Thank you. Holt nodded and turned. He didn't look back. Gave them the dignity to choose. Nora gathered the girls and followed him toward the golden light. With every step, she braced for the catch, for the price of this miracle. Because in her world, nothing came free. But Holt Vance didn't ask for a damn thing. He just opened the door, and for the first time in 93 nights, warmth found them before death did. If that lit a spark in your heart, friend, don't let it fade. Hit that subscribe button and stick around for the rest of this journey. This story's only just begun. The warmth hit harder than any bullet Nora Tate had ever felt. The moment Holt Vance swung that cabin door wide, the heat rolled out like a living thing. Thick, dry, almost cruel in how it made her realize just how cold she'd been for so long. The girls stumbled inside, their small bodies surrendering all at once to the promise of safety. Nora stepped in last, heart still clenched like a fist, waiting for the catch. Sit down, Holt said simply, motioning to the 2 chairs near the hearth. Get close. Fire's been burning steady since dusk. Pearl dropped into the chair like her knees had buckled. Faye curled into the other, swallowed up in that sheepskin coat, her rag doll cradled in one arm, the other stretching out toward the flames. That little sigh she let out, half sob, half relief, damn near cracked Nora in 2. Holt moved to the stove, steady and wordless, ladling stew from a black pot that hissed when he scraped bottom. The smell, beef, onion, maybe some turnip, hit Nora with such force her stomach near howled. She didn't realize she was swaying till Holt pressed a rough wooden bowl into her hands. Eat. Pearl clutched her own bowl with both hands, sipping carefully, proper like she'd been taught. Faye didn't wait. She dug in like a pup, broth dribbling down her chin, eyes wild and grateful. Nora just stared at hers, steam curling up into her face. How long since someone handed you supper without wanting something in return? Holt asked, not unkind. She looked up. Too long. Well, he said, settling into a chair across from her. I ain't asking for nothing. It should have calmed her. It didn't. Kindness like that always came with a hook, just maybe deeper set than most. I don't know what to do with all this, she said quietly. You don't gotta do anything, Holt replied. Just eat. Rest. Tomorrow's problem can stay where it is. Nora lifted her spoon. The first bite burned her tongue, and she welcomed the pain. It was real. Heavy. Not some memory. They ate in silence, save the crackle of fire and the clink of spoons. Holt nursed a tin of black coffee, watching them with the look of a man trying to make sure what he was seeing wasn't a fever dream. You planning on heading to Montana on foot? He asked, eyes still on the girls. Nora set her bowl down, her appetite suddenly gone. Yes. You do know that road's 300 miles north? Through Mountain Pass, snow, and worse. I know. You got no wagon, no horse. I've got 2 girls and a promise I made. Holt didn't argue. He just nodded, slow. Sometimes promises get folks killed. We'll manage. He didn't press her, and somehow that made her trust him a little more. When the bowls were empty, he stood. You'll take my bed, all 3 of you. I'll take the chair. We can't. You will, he cut in, calm but firm. I've slept in worse places than that chair, believe me. But it ain't right. Holt's voice softened, just a hair. You're not taken. I'm given. There's a difference. Faye yawned, wide-mouthed, small hands curling into fists. Pearl looked like she was trying to stay upright out of pride alone. Nora folded. All right. Quilts are clean. Wash basin's there in the corner. Y'all settle in. I'll keep the fire hot through the night. As she tucked her daughters into that bed, thick quilts swallowing them whole, a strange ache rose in her chest. Something between gratitude and grief. Faye was already asleep, thumb in mouth. Pearl was staring at the ceiling, her eyes wet and blinking slow. Mama, she whispered, do you think he's going to make us leave tomorrow? Nora paused. I don't know, baby, but I don't think so. Pearl nodded once. Okay. When Nora finally turned back to the hearth, Holt handed her a cup of coffee and sat down without a word. They drank in silence. You want to ask me something? He said eventually. She did. What's your angle, Holt Vance? He didn't look offended, just thoughtful. Somebody helped me once, pulled me out of a bad spell. They didn't ask nothing in return. Told me, only thing worth more than kindness is passing it forward. Been waiting a long time to do that. Nora's throat tightened. I don't know how to say thank you. Then don't, he said. Just don't die out there. And for the first time in months, maybe longer, she didn't feel like she had to carry everything on her own. Not tonight. Nora woke to silence. Not peace, not calm. The kind of silence that felt wrong, like the world had stopped breathing. She sat up slow, muscles stiff from days of strain, and glanced towards the window. The light outside was a pale, eerie gray. Frost feathered the glass. She pulled back the threadbare curtain and felt her stomach drop. Snow. Not dusting. Not a soft winter sprinkle. A white wall, thick and merciless, burying everything. Barn, fence, trail, under drifts that came up near the sill. 2 feet, easy, maybe more. The road to Montana? Gone. Holt was already at the stove, moving quiet, like he didn't want to break the spell. Coffee's hot, he said, not turning. How long's it been fallin'? She asked. Most the night. Started hard around midnight. She joined him, clutching the tin cup he offered like it was a lifeline. We can't stay here, Holt. You ain't got much of a choice. Her eyes met his. I didn't ask for your charity. This ain't charity, he said flatly. It's weather. That shut her up. He handed her a second mug. One for Pearl. I figured she'd be the first up. Right on cue, the girl padded out of bed, rubbing her eyes, hair wild. Mama? I'm here, Nora said, setting the mug in her hands. Faye followed soon after, blinking sleep from her eyes. She looked around the cabin, then let out a breath that sounded like something she'd been holding all night. They ate breakfast in a hush, the fire crackling loud in the quiet. Holt served eggs and toast, the kind of simple meal that tasted like gold when you hadn't had warmth in your bones for months. Afterward, Nora stood at the window again. Her voice was a whisper. I was gonna make it. Holt didn't pretend not to hear. You still might, just not today. I can't sit still, not with him out there. Walking blind into snow like that ain't brave. It's suicidal. Nora turned on him. You don't understand. I understand more than you think. She crossed her arms. I ain't a beggar. You want to work? Holt said, setting his coffee down with a soft thud. Fine. You work. That stopped her. He nodded toward the hearth. There's mending to do. Shirts, socks. Cabin needs cleaning. I've been living like a damn hermit. And food? She asked. You cook, I'll eat. Deal? Her pride battled her common sense for a beat, but the latter won. Deal. From that moment, everything shifted. Holt didn't treat her like a guest, and she didn't act like one. She was up sweeping the floor, shaking out old blankets, washing what she could. She boiled stew from potatoes and cured beef, made it stretch, seasoned it with salt and grit. Pearl helped without being asked. She followed Holt to the barn, asked questions about the horses, how to curry their coats, how to tell when feed was going bad. Holt showed her without fanfare, answering like she was grown. She's smart, he said to Nora that evening. Sharp as a tack. She used to sing, Nora replied. Before the walk, before the cold. She'll sing again? They sat in front of the fire after the girls went to bed, drinking the last of the day's coffee. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin the silence had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was breath. Where was he headed? Holt asked, voice low. Jeb? The mines near Helena? Said 6 months. It's been over that. You think he's still there? I think I need to see it with my own eyes. Holt didn't argue. He just nodded. You think I'm a fool, she said. I think you're a mother, he replied. And that's a whole different kind of stubborn. She laughed. Just once. Short and raw. You ever lose someone? She asked him. My wife, he said, looking into the fire. 3 winters ago. Nora's voice softened. That's why you live like this? He shrugged. It's easier to be lonely than disappointed. They sat in silence again. Not the heavy kind. Just the kind that lets you breathe. You plan to wait out the storm, then head north? He asked finally. She nodded. Then when the snow clears, I'll take you. Her head snapped toward him. What? You'll never make it on your own. But I know the roads. I got a wagon, a good horse. I'll take you. Why? Because you're going either way, and if you die out there, I'll have to live with that. She blinked fast. I can't repay you. I ain't asking. He stood, tossed another log into the fire. Tonight you sleep. Tomorrow we get to work. You want to reach Montana, you're gonna need more than will. You're gonna need a plan. Nora stared into the flames, the words settling deep. A plan. It wasn't much, but for the first time, it was something real. The storm didn't let up quick. It lingered like a wound that refused to scab over, cold, white, and cruel. But inside Holt's cabin, something else had started to thaw. Nora moved through the days like a woman reborn. Not healed, not whole, but steady. The kind of steady that comes from honest work, warm food, and the quiet knowledge that her girls had made it through another night without frostbite or fear. She cooked, scrubbed, stitched worn flannel until her fingers cramped. Not because she owed it, but because it anchored her. Holt didn't hover. He offered no pity, just space. And sometimes, space was the greatest mercy a man could give. One morning, Holt tapped Pearl on the shoulder, nodded towards the barn. Reckon I need help with those horses. The girl lit up like someone struck a match behind her ribs. Nora watched from the window as Holt showed Pearl how to hold the curry comb, how to move gentle across the chestnut mare's coat, slow and rhythmic like a song. He spoke to her like she wasn't just some half-starved stray from the road, but a capable, clever hand. When they came back inside, Pearl's cheeks were red with cold and pride. "She's got a good touch," Holt said. "Animal sense." "She always did," Nora replied. "Her daddy never noticed." Faye, still quiet as smoke, had taken to curling up by the fire with her rag doll, watching the world like it might bite her if she blinked too long. But now she smiled more. Once, Nora even caught her humming. That night, Nora stirred stew while Holt chopped wood just outside. Snow piled high against the window panes, but the cabin pulsed with warmth. "You're wearing my coat again," Holt said when he came in, nodding toward Faye, bundled up in the sheepskin. "Seems she's claimed it," Nora answered. "I reckon she can keep it. Ain't worn it proper in years anyhow." She didn't know what to say to that, so she ladled stew into bowls and handed his over without a word. After supper, the girls curled up on the bed, and Holt poured coffee for two. They sat by the fire, quiet except for the pop of pine sap in the flames. "You ever get used to it?" Nora asked. "Used to what?" "Being alone." Holt didn't answer right off. He sipped his coffee, then set it down with a long breath. "Not really. You just stop expecting anything else." She looked over at him, saw the wear in his face, creases etched deep from years of hard weather and harder loss. "This place used to feel like a coffin," he said. "Then y'all showed up and now it breathes again." Nora's throat tightened. She turned her eyes to the fire. "You saved us, Holt." "I didn't save anybody. I just opened a door." "No," she said. "You let us live. That matters." He studied her face, the way one might study a storm on the horizon. Half awe, half caution. "You ever think maybe," he said slowly, "this cabin wasn't meant to stay empty?" Nora didn't answer. But in the silence, her eyes stung. "I'm not saying anything needs to change," he added. "Just, it's nice, having boots at the door that aren't mine." The firelight danced between them. And for the first time in a long, long while, Nora felt something stir in her chest. Hope. Dangerous, bright, foolish hope. Not for Jeb, not for what was, but for something else. "You ever think maybe," she said, echoing his words, "some people come into your life just when you're about to give up?" He smiled, slow and crooked. "Sometimes I think they show up because they're just as lost." They sat like that for a long time. When the fire burned low and the coffee ran cold, Holt rose and threw another log on the flames. "Get some sleep, Nora. Long day tomorrow." She watched him, strong shoulders silhouetted against the firelight, and realized something that shook her more than the snow ever had. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. The sun came out on the 7th day. It didn't bring warmth, not really, but it turned the endless white into something near blinding. The drifts sparkled like God had scattered diamonds across the Wyoming dirt, and the wind finally hushed, like even the sky had run out of fight. Holt stood on the porch, boots planted in fresh snow, thumb hooked in his belt. "Looks like the road's starting to show." Nora joined him, arms crossed tight over her chest. The cold still stung, but after so many days inside, the open air tasted sharp and clean. Behind them, the girls laughed. Actual laughter, as they kicked powder into the air, chasing each other like pups let out of a cage. He turned toward her. "I'm heading to town. Wagon's got just enough give to make it if I keep to the low trail. Could use a few supplies. Wire some money to my neighbor. Let him know he might be watching the place a while." Nora's throat dried at that. A while. "I'll be back by sundown," Holt added. "You and the girls stay close to the fire." She nodded. "Don't take risks." He tipped his hat, then called over his shoulder, "Pearl, you're in charge while I'm gone." Pearl grinned so wide her cheeks turned pink. It was late afternoon when Holt returned, snow dusting his shoulders, his jaw set tight like a man carrying more than sacks and salt. He walked straight to Nora, handed her a folded paper, creased, smudged, and addressed in a shaky scrawl. She stared at it like it might catch fire. "Name's Chen," Holt said quietly. "Used to work the mines near Helena. Said he knew your husband." Nora's hands wouldn't stop trembling. She broke the seal with numb fingers, unfolded the paper. It was short, no more than 8 lines, but each word carved its weight deep into her chest. Jeb Tate was dead. Tunnel collapse. 6 weeks ago. Chen had tried to pull him out himself, but it was too late. He died quick, they said. Didn't suffer long. In his pocket was $47 and a torn scrap of paper addressed to her. "I'm sorry. I thought I'd make it right." That was it. The letter slid from her fingers and drifted to the floor like a dying leaf. She didn't fall to her knees, didn't scream, just folded in on herself. Holt caught her before she hit the stove. She didn't cry, not yet. She couldn't. Her face was stone, arms limp as a broken scarecrow as he guided her to a chair. Pearl stood frozen in the doorway. Faye clutched the sheepskin coat tight around her chest. "He's gone," Nora said flatly. The silence in the room cracked. Pearl blinked, once, twice, then nodded like she already knew. Faye whimpered. But he said he'd come back." Nora tried to speak, but her throat closed tight. Holt knelt beside the girls, rested a hand on each of their shoulders. "Your daddy ain't coming back, sweetheart. But your mama? She walked through snow and hell for you. That kind of love don't die." Faye cried, real tears now, and it cracked something loose in Nora's ribs. Not just grief. Grief she knew how to carry. This was worse. This was the nothing, the senselessness of it all. She'd walked through blizzards, bartered pride for food, scraped frost-bitten hands through trash heaps. For what? A ghost. A man who'd meant well. But good intentions didn't keep children warm. They didn't build a life. She finally spoke, voice ragged. "I walked 300 miles to bury a man I won't even get to see." "You didn't walk for him," Holt said. "You walked for them." She turned to him, fury and despair all tangled together. "What do I do now?" "You start over." "How?" "You breathe. You feed 'em, you rest. Then tomorrow you do it again." The dam broke. Not a sob, not even tears. Just a long, keening sound pulled from someplace deep in her gut. Holt didn't say a word. He held her as the fire snapped and the sun bled orange behind the pines. And for the first time since June, Nora Tate let the truth settle in her bones. Jeb was gone. But she wasn't, and neither were the girls. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something worth staying for. It snowed again that night, just a soft dusting, the kind that blanketed the world in silence, like nature itself was offering a hush for the dead. Nora didn't sleep. She sat by the fire with Jeb's letter in her lap, reading it over and over like it might change. Like maybe if she stared hard enough, he'd explain why he'd gone so far only to die alone in the dark. The girls were asleep in the bed, curled up like pups in that big sheepskin quilt Holt kept pulling tighter around them. They didn't stir much. Grief has a way of wearing a body down, especially when it's small. Morning came gray and still. She didn't want to tell them. She wanted to keep pretending they were just snowed in, just waiting for spring to come like normal folks. But normal had died with Jeb. She sat them down after breakfast. Quiet as a funeral, Pearl perched straight as a fence post, eyes already bracing. Faye curled into her side, sensing the weight in the room even if she didn't understand it. Nora held the letter in both hands like it might blow away if she let go. "Your daddy's gone," she said. No tears in her voice, no shaking, just the cold truth of it. "He died in a tunnel collapse at the mine. A man named Chen wrote to tell me." Pearl didn't blink, just nodded slow, like she'd already buried that part of herself weeks ago. "Faye, though." Faye crumbled. "No, Mama," she whimpered. "He promised. He said he'd come for us." "I know, baby," Nora whispered, pulling her close. "I know." Faye sobbed into her chest. "It ain't fair." "No, it ain't." Pearl stood up, walked to the window and stared out at the snow. "You knew, didn't you?" Nora asked gently. The girl didn't answer. Just said, "He stopped writing, I figured." There was no malice in her tone, just resignation, like she'd been carrying that weight a while now, and this only made it official. Later, when the girls were quiet again, Nora found herself outside, chopping wood with a fury that surprised even her. Every swing cracked louder than the last. She wasn't cold. She wasn't tired. She was angry. Not just at Jeb. For leaving, for failing, for dying before he could fix it. She was angry at herself. For hoping. "You're gonna wear yourself out," Holt said behind her, hands in his coat pockets. "I need to be doing something," she muttered. He nodded, walked over, and picked up the split logs, stacking them without a word. They worked side by side until the pile was high and the rhythm of it had calmed her blood. Inside, Holt stirred the fire back to life while Nora sat, her shoulders slumped. "I feel relief," she said suddenly, "and that makes me feel like a monster." Holt looked up, surprised. "Relief?" "No more wondering. No more planning for a man who's never coming back. I ain't got to chase his shadow anymore." She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. "I feel like I should be ashamed." Holt poured coffee, handed her a cup, and sat across from her. "You ain't wicked," he said. "You're just human. Ain't no sin in being grateful that the worst kind of waiting is over." She looked into the fire, the light flickering in her tired eyes. "I don't know what to do now." "Well," he said, taking a slow sip. "You start from where you are. Where am I?" "You're safe. You're fed. You've got 2 girls who love you more than the world. That's a good damn place to be." She let out a breath, half sigh, half sob, and it felt like the first honest breath she'd taken since September. After supper that night, Faye crawled into Holt's lap without a word. He didn't flinch, didn't even act surprised. He wrapped an arm around her like he'd been doing it all his life. Pearl sat beside him on the floor, leaning against his knee. Nora watched them. Her girls curled against a man who wasn't their father, but sure as hell treated them better than Jeb ever did. Her chest ached, not from grief, but from something newer, something warmer. Maybe even the first stirrings of peace. Holt looked up and met her gaze. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Spring hadn't arrived, not by a damn sight, but the worst of the snow had passed. Nora had just finished sweeping the hearth when she heard the dogs growl low. Not bark, growl, the kind of warning that cut through bone. She froze. Holt was already at the window. He didn't say a word, just stepped back from the glass and grabbed the Winchester from above the door. Nora's heart kicked like a mule. 3 riders came into view, all grit and shadow. The lead wore a scar that split his lip and cheek like a crooked canyon. He sat easy in the saddle, like a man who'd done worse things than ride into someone else's life uninvited. "Who is it?" she asked. Trouble, Holt muttered. Name's Dutch Langley. Ran with some bounty boys out of Cheyenne years back. That one behind him, Reno. He's meaner than Dutch and dumber than a stump. The third man, lean and quiet, kept his eyes low. They dismounted without a word, boots crunching against crusted snow. Dutch tipped his hat. Afternoon? Holt didn't move. State your business. Dutch grinned. It made the scar pucker. We're looking for a widow. Name's Nora Tate. Nora stepped forward before Holt could stop her. I'm Nora. He shot her a look that said, don't, but it was too late. Dutch's smile widened. Well, ain't you a sight? You were married to a Jebediah Tate, correct? Her stomach twisted. I was. Well, ma'am, seems your dearly departed left more than grief behind. He left a debt, $500 to be exact. That's not possible, Nora said. We didn't have nothing, not even boots that matched. He borrowed it from a man named Starnes, Dutch said smoothly. A loan he never paid back, and Starnes don't take kindly to broken promises. I didn't borrow a damn cent. Maybe not, but you married the man. That makes you the closest thing to collateral he left. Reno chuckled darkly. And you're prettier than coin, if I'm being honest. Holt stepped forward then, putting himself square between her and them. His voice was calm, but every muscle in his body spoke one clear message. Try it. She's not going anywhere. Dutch raised his brows. Is that right? She's under my roof. That makes her under my protection. Reno spat into the snow. That a threat? No, it's a promise. Dutch's eyes scanned the porch, the cabin, the windows. You gonna kill 3 men over a woman you just met? If I have to, Holt said, leveling the Winchester. The wind stopped. Reno's hand drifted near his holster, but Dutch held up a single finger. Easy, he said. We ain't looking for gunplay, yet. He turned back to Nora. We'll give you 3 days, then we come back. You can ride with us and settle the debt nice and clean, or we drag you out by your hair. Nora's fists clenched at her sides. Dutch tipped his hat again. 3 days. The men mounted up and rode off, slow and unhurried, like they had all the time in the world. Inside, Holt barred the door and locked the windows. His face was stone. I'll handle it, she said, voice shaking. No, you won't. I won't let them hurt you or the girls. He grabbed her shoulders, not rough, but firm enough to break through the storm in her chest. Nora, you're not alone anymore. This is our fight now. Tears welled up, but she shoved them down. Why would you risk your life for me? Holt didn't hesitate. Because some things are worth risking for. The girls watched from the loft, silent as ghosts. The wolves were at the door. But this time, Nora wasn't facing them by herself. They came at dawn, just like Holt figured they would. He hadn't slept. Neither had Nora. While the girls slept curled together upstairs, Holt had fortified the place. Boards over the windows, extra logs stacked near the fire. Ammo counted and loaded. He moved with purpose, but not panic. Like a man who'd seen this kind of trouble before. You ever shoot a rifle? He asked Nora, handing her the Henry repeater. I can aim, she said. I can pull a trigger. That'll do. She'd already sent Pearl and Faye up to the crawl space behind the loft. Blankets, biscuits, and a single candle for light. You stay quiet till you hear my voice, she told them, no matter what happens. Pearl, trying to be brave, had nodded hard. Faye just cried silent, terrified tears. Now, as light bled over the ridge, the sound of hoofbeats stirred the still air. They came in a pack this time, 8 riders, guns on their hips and ugly in their eyes. Dutch Langley led the charge, reins tight, coat flapping in the wind like a vulture's wing. He stopped a dozen yards from the porch. "Morning," he called, like it was a social call. Holt stepped out, rifle in hand. "That's close enough." "Come on now," Dutch said. "You really want to die over a woman you barely know?" Holt didn't answer, just leveled the barrel. Dutch laughed. "Ain't you noble? But here's the truth. We're taking the girl, and there ain't enough bullets in that cabin to stop us all." Nora appeared in the doorway then, rifle in hand, chin high. "Try it." "You got sand, I'll give you that," Dutch sneered. "But we've seen this dance before. Ends the same every time, with the floor slick and bodies cooling." Then came the sound neither side expected. Hooves. Many. Fast. From the tree line to the west, a second group of riders came in. A half-dozen men, led by Zeke Boone, a thick-bellied rancher with a voice like thunder and a shotgun that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. Zeke rode straight up beside Holt. "Thought you might need a hand," he said, eyes never leaving Dutch. Holt gave him a single nod. "Appreciate it." Dutch's eyes darted between the new arrivals. He was doing math, and the numbers weren't liking him. "You're really going to make this messy?" he asked. "You made it messy the second you threatened that woman," Zeke said. "Now either ride off or we put you in the ground." Behind him, one of the townsmen cocked his rifle for punctuation. Reno shifted in his saddle. "They ain't bluffing, Dutch." Dutch stared at Holt, long, hard, like he was trying to read a man who didn't flinch. Then he spat into the snow. "This ain't over," he said. "No," Holt replied. "It is. If you ride back here, I won't ask questions next time." Dutch lingered a moment longer, then yanked his reins. The others followed. Dust and cold kicked up behind them as they galloped back down the trail, leaving nothing but hoofprints and the sour stench of pride. Nora finally exhaled. Zeke tipped his hat. "Well, damn, Holt. Didn't figure you'd turn into a family man overnight." Holt chuckled. "Neither did I." Zeke looked to Nora. "You all right, miss?" She nodded, jaw tight. "We will be." He looked back at Holt. "We'll keep an eye on the road for a while, just in case." Then the riders turned and left, leaving the cabin quiet once more. Holt stepped back inside, set the rifle down, and shut the door. He turned to Nora. Her eyes were glassy, hands still shaking. "You were ready to die for me," she whispered. "I was ready to live for you," he said. "Big difference." She reached for his hand, and for the first time since this all began, it wasn't fear holding her steady. It was him. The snow had started to melt, just enough to turn the path into muddy ruts and make boots stick. Spring was crawling in slow, stubborn, like it was unsure if it wanted to stay. 3 days after the standoff, Zeke and Etta Boone came by again, this time with something more than firepower and neighborly concern. They brought an offer. "We've got a little house on the edge of our south pasture," Etta said, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee at Holt's table. "Used to be for a ranch hand, but it's sat empty since my brother passed." "She's saying we'd like you to have it," Zeke cut in. "If you want it," Nora blinked. "You're offering me a house?" "A job, too," Etta added. "We need help on the ranch, cooking, organizing. Someone with a good head and steady hands. You strike me as both." Pearl sat still as stone beside the fire. Faye looked up from her rag doll, eyes wide. Nora's first instinct was to say no. Not out of pride anymore. Just fear. Fear of anchoring herself somewhere again. Fear of letting hope in after it had burned her before. But then she looked around. At Holt, quietly sipping his coffee. At her girls, safe and fed. At the rifle still leaning near the door like a promise kept. It wasn't just a house they were offering. It was a future. Later that afternoon, Nora helped the girls pack what little they had. Faye wept, clinging to the bedpost. "I don't want to leave Mr. Holt." Nora knelt beside her. "We're not leaving him, baby. Just visiting some space to think." But deep down, she was doing the same thing, putting distance between herself and the man who had made her feel safe for the first time in years. Zeke hitched the wagon. Nora climbed in, her girls beside her. Holt stood at the gate, arms folded, face unreadable. She called to him. "I didn't say goodbye." He nodded once. "Didn't think you had." They rode in silence for a good stretch before Pearl finally said, "He didn't want us to go." Nora glanced up at the sky. No, he didn't. They reached the Boone Ranch near sundown. Etta showed them the little house. It was small, square, and honest. Wooden floorboards, a real stove, glass windows. For the girls, it was a castle. But for Nora, it felt like a crossroad. 3 days later, Holt rode up in the dark and stopped them under a cottonwood tree. Nora had gone for a walk to clear her head. She heard the horse first, then saw him sitting tall in the saddle, hat pulled low. He dismounted, not rushing. Just watching her, like she might bolt if he moved too quick. "I ain't never chased a woman before," he said, voice low. "I figure you ought to know that." "You didn't have to chase me." He took a step closer. "Then why'd you leave?" She looked down. "Because I didn't think it was fair. For you, for the girls. I didn't want to be your burden." "You were never a burden. You were a fire in a cold place." She swallowed hard. "I don't know what I am anymore." "You're a mother, a survivor, and the only person I've wanted to wake up beside in 3 long years." The stars stretched above them, silent and steady. "I'm not asking to replace Jeb," he said. "I'm asking for the chance to build something that don't hurt to hold." Nora's breath caught in her chest. "You asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "To make a home. To be mine, if you want that." She stepped into his arms, the smell of saddle leather and pine smoke wrapping around her like an old song. "I want that," she whispered. The wedding came a week later. Just them, the girls, Zeke and Etta, and a sky so blue it made your chest ache. Nora wore a blue cotton dress. Holt cleaned up, even shaved. Faye threw pine needles like they were flower petals. Pearl read a poem she wrote herself. They said their vows under that same cottonwood tree. Not perfect, not fairy tale, but real, and enough. 2 years later. The land had changed, so had they. The snow no longer blanketed fear. Now it signaled firewood stacked and preserves sealed tight. The cabin had grown, same as the family. The barn was fixed, fences mended. Even the porch had been widened to fit more boots, more rocking chairs, more laughter. Nora knelt in the garden, dirt under her fingernails, and a baby monitor tucked into her apron pocket. A gift from Etta Boone, who'd declared it a modern miracle. A soft wail came from the window above, and she smiled. "Coming, little man," she called. Beau Vance, Holt's son, her son, had arrived during the first spring rain last year. He was loud, squishy, and adored beyond sense. His eyes were clear and stubborn like his father's. His smile crooked like Jeb's used to be when he was young and full of promises. Inside, the house was warm and loud. Pearl, now 10, read by the fire, legs tucked under her. She'd taken to her books with a hunger Nora never had. Etta said she was smart enough for college one day. Nora believed her. Faye was barefoot on the porch, singing to the hens like they were a choir. Her hair had grown long, sun-bleached, and full of leaves more days than not. And Holt, he was out back, teaching a ranch hand how to brace the new fence before spring calving hit. He moved like a man younger than he was, because love had a way of unbuckling the weight from your shoulders. Nora reached into her apron and pulled out a worn envelope. It had arrived the day before. $47, the last of Jeb Tate's belongings, sent from a bank clerk in Helena who'd finally closed out the estate. The note was cold and formal, but the money, it burned warm in her hand. She could have tucked it away. Instead, she took it to Holt that evening. "I want to buy that east plot," she said. "The one with the creek." Holt wiped his hands on a rag. "You thinking of building?" "Not for us," she said. "For them, Pearl, Faye, maybe Bo, too, someday." He looked at her long, then nodded. "We'll make it theirs." That night, she tucked the $47 into a coffee can marked Future and set it on the shelf. Not out of sentiment, but because turning loss into legacy was the only way Jeb's story could mean something more than a grave in a collapsed tunnel. Later, after supper, they sat out on the porch. Nora rocked Bo in her arms, watching the stars blink through cottonwood branches. Holt's hand rested on hers. Not tight. Just there. Solid. "You ever regret not making it to Montana?" he asked. She looked at him. The house, the light from the windows, the sounds of her daughters laughing inside. "Never," he nodded, eyes forward. "Funny, ain't it? All that pain led you right here." "Rotten apples," she said quietly. "You remember?" "I remember." "They saved us," she said. "No," he replied. "You did." The porch light hummed. The crickets sang their nightly tune. Nora leaned back, cradling her son, watching the life she'd built from ashes and snow. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rooted, grounded. "Now it's your turn, friend. What would you have done in Nora's boots? Would you have walked into the storm? Or stayed behind the fire? Let that settle deep. And if this story meant something to you, share it. The West ain't just a place. Sometimes it's a choice. And sometimes it's where you finally find your way back to yourself. Thanks for riding with us.